Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am Jean McMahon, the Vice Chair of the Alliance for Diversity, Education, Practice, and Transformation, ADEPT, formerly known as the New Jersey Statewide Network for Cultural Competence. We are pleased to welcome you here today to our very first webinar of the new year, 2025. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our distinguished presenter today, Keva White. Keva is an educator by profession and an entrepreneur by nature. Keva spent several years working for community-based organizations before founding his own company, VIP Community Services, in 2006. Since then, his company has provided high-quality training and consulting services for social service providers, schools, behavioral health agencies, philanthropic foundations, and healthcare organizations. A nationally sought-after racial equity consultant and keynote speaker, Keva is a dynamic presenter, as you'll see today, with an embracing sense of humor, who uniformly receives high marks for his teaching skills. He received formal training as a certified cultural and linguistic competence trainer from the National Multicultural Institute out of Washington, D.C. Keva is a graduate of Bryn Mawr School of Social Work's nonprofit Executive Leadership Institute, and since 2016 continues to serve as a part-time lecturer at Rutgers University School of Social Work. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Keva to start our day.
All right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Jean. Thank you so much for that warm welcome and great introduction. Thank you to the Alliance for putting this webinar on today. It's a timely discussion, in my opinion. So I want to just welcome you all to today's webinar on this powerful and often overlooked topic of microaggressions. So thank you so much. You know, microaggressions are small, everyday actions or comments that can unintentionally hurt or marginalize others based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, or other aspects of identity. You know, while they may seem minor on the surface, their cumulative impact can be profound in nature in terms of the person on the receiving end of these so-called microaggressions. We're going to give some comprehensive definitions around that in a second, but I think that cumulative impact on the person on the receiving end can really lead to a work or social environment where people feel less valued, where people feel less respected, where people's sense of psychological safety begins to wane. And so I think in today's webinar, it's very important that we'll explore microaggressions and how they are manifested in different settings, and most importantly, how we can better recognize, respond to, and prevent them from happening. Today's webinar is meant to serve as a courageous conversation around this term microaggressions, and I'm going to be presenting it from a liberatory and a social consciousness perspective. What I mean by a liberatory perspective, Dr. Barbara Love developed this framework entitled Liberatory Consciousness, which I teach at Rutgers University. And what Dr. Barbara Love encourages us to do is to not be socialized by social narratives and terminologies that we tend to embrace, that we should be free to seek higher level of awareness. We should be free to analyze information. We should be hold ourselves accountable, not to repeat depriving types of behaviors towards marginalized groups, and to become allies to make sure that we share information and we make sure that we educate on these subject matters. So that's my approach for this morning's webinar. And I would like to do it in three ways. I'm going to identify and define unconscious bias. Also, we're going to be using it interchangeably: unconscious bias, microaggressions, implicit bias. And I'm going to give you my rant about some of these terminologies in a second. And we really want to look at how they can negatively impact team dynamics. So I'm going to be presenting this in the framing of the workplace environment. As a racial equity consultant, we work with a lot of organizations that have challenges in the workplace around these issues. And I think from a professional development standpoint and a leadership principle practice model standpoint, that this topic and subject matter is very important. Then I'm going to review an evidence-based response protocol to address microaggressions in the workplace. It's an action-oriented response protocol. And then hopefully we can engage in some courageous conversations around the subject matter. There will be spots in today's webinar where we will do some post checks and check in with you all and get your feedback and thoughts on what we're talking about today. Most webinars are non-interactive. I like to be interactive to some degree, so we're gonna use that process today. Okay. So by way of definition, microaggressions, this term microaggressions, right? There's several definitions out there, but this is the one that's coming from the American Psychological Association. And it states that microaggressions are commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities. And here's the catch, that are either intentional or unintentional, but they communicate some type of hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights or insults. And so when we think about this term commonplace, when we think about it, another definition said they're everyday. That means that people are exposed or being impacted by these type of behaviors or these type of words on a daily basis. Another definition was coined by the creator of this term, microaggressions, Dr. Chester M. Pierce. He's an American psychiatrist, and he was a tenured professor of education and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He first defined microaggressions as a subtle, again, often unintentional comments or behaviors that convey prejudice, attitudes, or stereotypes about a marginalized group, right? So when we think about this definition, microaggression, here's my rant about this. Because I believe in society, the way that we name things is how we claim it, right? So this term microaggressions, here's my rant around this term microaggression. The term or the prefix of micro tends to indicate that it's a small or minor infraction, right? So when we think about the intent versus impact, so the intent may be a minor issue on the person that's giving it out, but on the receiving end, the impact that a person may be feeling on the receiving end in terms of their emotional and psychological stability can be devastating. So that's why I term this talk microaggressions, small gestures that create big problems in the workplace in our society, because they may be subtle and the person that's wielding it or initiating it may seem that it's a minor thing. Why are you being so sensitive about this? Don't take it, don't be so serious. However, we don't know the experiences of others. We don't know the exposure to racism and bias, the history of that. And so when we have microaggressions be presented to someone, the person on the receiving end, even though it's subtle, they may feel a sharp sting, a sharp emotional sting, a sharp psychological sting that hinders their state in the moment. So while microaggressions may appear to seem innocent and harmless in nature, or harmless comments in nature, in my opinion, from a liberatory consciousness, microaggressions reinforces stereotypes and are a form of discrimination, right? And so if for those on the call today, if you are a leader within the organization, you should have anti-discriminatory policies in place, and there should be some kind of language that alludes to this concept of microaggressions, because they're commonplace and they're often dubbed as everyday. We see it every day. We experience it every day, right? But I wanted to check in with you all this morning real quick. I think we have enough people to engage in some chat check, what I call chat check. So when you hear these terms micro, unconscious, implicit, unintentional, and unconscious, that the unconscious one really gets to me, unconscious bias. Now, I've been unconscious before. Now, not knocked out, not like Muhammad Ali knocked out type of unconscious, but I've been unconscious. I just had shoulder surgery, and I was under anesthesia, and I was unconscious. I had no idea what was going on. From the time the nurse said, okay, Mr. White, we're just going to give you a little teaser to relax you. The next thing I know, I was waking up in the recovery room, drinking that hospital apple juice and sipping on and eating them crackers. So when we think about unconsciousness, how could you be unconscious and at the same time wielding slights and insults towards people in a harmful fashion? So when I think about micro, unconscious, implicit, unintentional, what's the challenge with those terminologies? What's the challenge with those prefixes in front of such a word as that's really action oriented, in my opinion, aggression? Just type in the chat. What do you think is a challenge when you hear microaggression, unconscious bias, implicit? What do you think is some of the challenges with that terminology? Let's get some interaction going on this morning. Chat time. What do you all think? It challenges it because it seems to remove responsibility. Kate, yep, no accountability, no responsibility. In some ways, it excuses the behavior. Absolutely, 100%, everybody. When we do that, what it does is it alleviates one's accountability. It condones the behavior and it becomes normalized behavior within the cultural landscape of an organization. Takes responsibility away from the predator. Yes, people think if it's unconscious, they can't change it. And we know all of these things are not true. It normalizes discrimination, oxymoron statements and words. All of those things are correct. All right. So that's my rant on this term, microaggression, because the way we name it is the way society claims it. That's what Dr. Barbara Loves means. We become socialized by words and terminology, and we have to break free of that because as you see in the chat check, it's not a micro thing. It's not a small thing. It's not a minor thing. People are not unconscious when they do it. They're alive, they're well, and they're aware. So let's dive into microaggressions and what are the types. There are three major types of microaggressions: micro assault, micro insult, and micro invalidation. And I'm going to briefly describe these and I'm going to ask for some examples in each of these categories. So when we think about a micro assault, now listen to the definitions and in your mind, as we go through these, in your mind, continue to say to yourself, are these minor issues? Just look at this terminology, micro assault. Assault, in my opinion, is not a minor issue. If you assault somebody, there's criminal charges that you can face as a result of that. If you physically assault somebody, if you verbally assault somebody and attack somebody, there's laws and policies in place to protect people from that, right? But let's look at these. Micro assault. Now, here's the definition. It's not my definition. It's coming out of the American Psychological Association, right? So micro assault is the use of explicit racial degrading language that is oftentimes characterized by some type of verbal or nonverbal attack. It's usually manifested through name calling, avoiding behavior, and this is key. It's purposeful. There's intentionality here to cause some type of psychological, emotional, and if it's really egregious, it may even lead to some type of physical altercation. So when we think about micro assault, an example of that would be any racial epithet, but most importantly, since I'm a person of color, calling someone the N-word would be a primary example of a micro assault. So a colleague that's making a racially derogatory comment or using racial slurs in the break room, we're sitting in the break room, me, Gene, and Bob, and Zenaida, we're sitting in the break room having our lunch, and somebody's having a conversation outside of the lunchroom, and they're talking about the Eagles winning the Super Bowl. But in their talk, they're using racial epithets to describe some of the fans. And if I feel uncomfortable with that, and that's impacting me in a negative way, that's problematic. Another example of a micro insult would be using the terminology, you preface it with you people. Oh, that's a big one. You people, those people, them people. Anytime you use these, them, or those, you're starting to get into the realm of othering. Anytime you preface something, these people, you people, for example, you people are always so sensitive. Those people who live in the projects need to really get their act together. Could be micro assault on a particular population or group of individuals based upon their racial or cultural heritage. Does anybody have another example of a micro assault? If you do, just type it in the chat. I said this is going to be a collegial conversation, and so let's just type it in the chat. Do you have another one? A micro assault, I consider that a macro assault. Thank you for that, Pearl. So we would have to do some evolution of terminology here. And these terminology do evolve over time. And like I said, it's not micro in my opinion. So I agree with you 100%. Sometimes it can be us when we say our people. Well, it depends on the context of that, Roland. If we're in the context of describing our heritage or our sense of pride, then it's appropriate in that nature. But when you're identifying and talking about another race or population and using that terminology, it could be deemed as offensive. The next one is micro insult, a micro insult. And here's where we are communicating rudeness, insensitivity, or statements that really are looking to demean a person's racial heritage or identity. So a micro insult. I call this covert communication. We're going to say something that's rude and insensitive, and we know it's targeting you as a representative of that specific group. And I'm doing this purposely to demean your heritage or your cultural identity. So some examples would be referring to an Asian employee as a chink, referring to a Jewish employee as a cheap Jew. Those would be some examples. And these are coming just out of my consultancy work. These are examples that we got from some of our clients. So when you think about a micro insult, it could be something as simple as, again, we're talking about in the workplace, as simple as an employee heating up a cultural dish, and someone walks into the break room and there's an aroma that's unfamiliar to them, and they walk in the lunchroom with their nose all up in the air, look like they sucking on a lemon. They go, who is cooking that? What is that smell smelling up the damn break room like that? They need to heat their food up. I wish you people would heat your food up at home before you come in here stinking up the break room. And the person is right there at the microwave heating up their food. Micro insult. Micro invalidation is the third example or type. Micro invalidation. This is an exclusionary. This is purposefully excluding or negating or nullifying the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential realities of a person based upon their racial, cultural heritage. Micro invalidation. The other day, a question was posed to me by one of my colleagues, but I thought the question was valid, and I said I would ask the group today. So the question that was presented to me around this microaggressions is, did I think that dismantling or the demonization of DEI is a form of microaggression? And so when I consider this definition or this microaggression type, this invalidation or this devaluation concept, I would say not only is it a micro invalidation, but it's also a micro insult. Just think about it. If you work for an organization who no longer values your uniqueness, your social identity uniqueness that you bring into the workplace from a social identity standpoint to their organization, in my opinion, this could be a subtle microaggression in the form of micro invalidation. I mean, this is what happened to me about 18 years ago. 18 years ago, I started VIP Community Service, my consultant organization, and I started it as a result of what I call the copy machine debacle. So I'm the only African-American, in social service, males are 1% representative. African-American males is less than 1% in the social work field. So I'm working for a social service agency in Philadelphia. It's a mid-manager position. I was a director overseeing programs. And so we're preparing for a strategic planning meeting, and I'm going to the copier to make copies of my department's operational plan and updates on that to give out to the rest of the executive management team, which is predominantly a homogeneous group of white employees. Again, I'm the only African-American person there. I'm going to the copy machine to copy my materials. And when I get to the copier machine, the finance director left the budget of the organization on the copying machine. And I got a copy and I looked at it. When you talk about somebody being fit to be tied, and I'm using vernacular right now, when I looked at that budget and I saw people that didn't look like me, that had less qualifications than me, that had less tenure than me, making $10,000, $20,000 more than me in the same position, I felt not only invalid or devalued, I felt like there was no value to me as an employee there. My mother always told me the higher education leads to higher earned income capacity. So I have a master's degree and two licenses, two active licenses, and people with less than that, less tenure. So not only did I feel devalued, I felt disrespected and I felt disenfranchised. So I had to discharge myself from that position. And I gave my 2 weeks notice and I started my business a month later. And I've been going strong ever since. So what happens, we're going to talk about response, right? We're going to talk about response in a second. When we fail to respond and recognize these microaggressions, one thing is most likely to happen, and this is for leaders that's on this webinar, the minimal look phenomenon is going to come into play. If we start to invalidate, devalue our employees through whether it's subtle, overt, or covert mechanisms, the minimal look phenomenon will come into practice for you. You will start to see it. So what do I mean by that? I'm glad you asked. Your employees will give you their bare minimum while they start looking for another job because they don't feel valued. They don't feel a value. And I think, unfortunately, in the climate that we're in now, when people are rolling back and scaling back DEI initiatives, particularly when you are a homogeneous leadership team and you have a diverse workforce and you rolling these things back, look for the minimum look phenomenon to start coming into play. Okay, so that's my rant. All right, so let's talk about overcoming response barriers, right? Because before we can respond to microaggressions, and I'm going to give you a response protocol, we need to understand, like, what are the barriers? Like, why do people sit in a seat of neutrality when they see or hear a microaggression playing out in the workplace, right? And I believe that it's a result of these three things I want to talk about. So when we think about these barriers or these response barriers, why people don't actively engage, I believe it's as a result of these three things here: indifference, silence, and fear. Most people don't respond because of indifference, a feeling of indifference. They sit in what I call a seat of silence, and they are paralyzed by fear. And these three things here, indifference, silence, and fear, are part of what we call bystander syndrome. And many of you are probably familiar with this terminology. Bystander syndrome is also referred to as the bystander effect or the apathetic effect. And so, as you see here in this illustration on the screen, we see somebody is in a crisis situation. 4 individuals see it, and they're thinking he probably doesn't need any help. He'll be okay. I guess someone else will help. He's probably just drunk, and everybody just passes by. We won't respond. You know what we'll do? We'll record. In my opinion, that's still inaction because the person that's in a crisis situation, they're not receiving any assistance. So we have to overcome this sense of indifference. And indifference, and I'm talking about in the workplace, same thing. Break room, we're hearing this ruckus outside of the break room. We know it's inappropriate. We know it's offensive. They're starting to target and talk about certain employees, and we hear that, and we are indifferent to the matter. One person says, I'm going to be late to a meeting. I ain't got nothing to do with that. The other person said, let's let HR handle that. This is not my responsibility. The other person has what I call a job keep mentality. Their level of indifference is because I'm not interested in this. I'm just here to do my job. That's not in my job description under other duties as described. So indifference really negates the importance and or need for change within the organization. It really says that we're okay with this behavior being part of our organizational culture. And one thing that I have come to realize, whether we accept it or not, is that discrimination in our society, more specifically in the workplace, affects everyone, especially when it's not addressed, right? It could affect us directly or indirectly from an emotional, psychological, and oftentimes economical standpoint. For example, an organization that gets sued for retaliation as a result of several employees putting in complaints to the Human Relations Commission, and those complaints were valid and they were found to be credible. And now there's class action lawsuits against this organization. Now, as a result of that, they need to lay off some employees. And you're one of the employees that had nothing to do with this incident of discrimination, yet you're still indirectly impacted by it. So since it affects all of us, it's going to take all of us to combat it when it shows up in the workplace with intentionality. We all have a collective responsibility to deal with workplace discrimination, workplace bias, microaggressions, prejudices. If we want to create what I call a workplace of harmony, we have to have a collective mindset in dealing with these things, and we need to overcome these barriers. The next one is silence. Silence to prevent violence. The last person that said something got fired. So I'm not going to say anything. Why speak up? Nothing ever changes. I said something about 5 times and they still allow this behavior to happen. So I'm keeping quiet. I'm just coming here to do my job. What if I offend someone, right? My philosophy around that is how could you offend the offender? You know, when we think about retaliation, there's laws that protect us against employer retaliation. It's embedded in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? And it prohibits an employee from retaliating against an employee because you are a mid-level employee and you filed a report against the CEO, right? So the power dynamics there, the differential, most people won't do that because of the power dynamics and the fear of retaliation. But there's laws that protect us against that. And so we have to engage. We have to engage in these discussions. We have to be able to do what Jim Collins says in his book, Good to Great. We have to discuss the brutal facts. We have to discuss the brutal facts that this particular person continues to do this, even though they're at the high seat of the organization. We're allowing it because we've stayed silent. And it's this concept of what really keeps us silent is this consciousness concept of that little voice. It's a little voice internally that says to us and it speaks to us in the midst of a crisis, whether or not we're going to act or whether or not we're going to stay inactive or whether or not we're going to react. We need to kind of like dissect this little voice. And I want to expose it here for a second by way of showing a quick video clip. And then I want to come back and get your thoughts and opinions on how does the little voice impact you when you are faced with some type of workplace discrimination, whether you see it yourself or it's reported by a third party. How does the little voice kind of start playing in your head to allow for you to make a decision whether or not I'm going to act, react, or be inactive? So let's take a look at this video clip real quick. And when we come back on the other side, I want to get some thoughts and feedback on it.
You know that little voice in your head? The one that tells you to ignore a tasteless joke.
The one that tells you to keep quiet when a client makes a racist comment.
The little voice that tells you you're not smart enough because English isn't your first language.
Or that it's okay to judge someone for leaving early because they have family commitments.
The one that tells you not to say anything when others are being reduced to stereotypes.
Or that it's not a big deal when everyone's opinion isn't considered.
You may think you're the only one that hears that voice, but that voice also speaks to other people. It says,
You're different.
You're an outsider.
You lack commitment.
Your opinion doesn't matter.
instead of listening to that little voice, you need to find yours and make it heard. It's time for all of us to speak up. Because when we change the dialogue, we can change our world.
When we think about the little voice, has anyone ever contended with that, the little voice? I call it conscious contemplation. When we see something, how do you contemplate with your conscious? That's what the little voice means to me. We have to overcome this conscious contemplation in the midst of witnessing workplace discrimination or a microaggression. What are your thoughts about that? feel free to type your response in the chat, or if you want to lend your voice to the conversation, feel free to hop off of mute and share your thoughts, because it leads into the last barrier that we need to overcome. What do you think? How does the little voice impact you in terms of responding? This is an interactive webinar. What do we have, people? Okay, Casey said, I think a lot of folks are conflict adverse and the fear really keeps them silent. There it is. So the fear of conflict, thank you, Casey. The fear of conflict is one of the reasons why most people don't respond. I love conflict. I'm gonna be honest with you. I love conflict because I think conflict is an effort to preserve a relationship. It's just how we engage in the conflict that most people are fearful of. But there'll be no more excuses after this webinar because I'm gonna give you a comprehensive, easy to do response protocol that will reduce the likelihood of fear to come into play. Because conflict is inevitable. Like I said, I love conflict. How many people on this call is married? Put your emoji in a hand in emoji, or put your hand up. If you married, all right, y'all got conflict. You got conflict, right? Conflict is inevitable in any relationship. It's how we manage it. And if we're conflict adverse and we want to shy away from that, we won't respond. I want to encourage you with Dr. Susan Jeffers' book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. So the next overcoming barrier is fear. How do we overcome this fear? Well, I like Dr. Susan Jeffers' book. She said you have to feel the fear and do it anyway. And this is the consciousness contemplation that goes into play. What if I say something wrong? What if I lose control? And this is the big one. What will they think of me if I say something, if I speak up and speak out? These are the fear factors. This is the what if. And you notice what if. And I break down the word if, IF, it's internalized fear. The what if factor, that's your internalized fear that leads to you being conflict adverse, using your terminology, Casey. Dr. Susan Jeffers' book, she talks about fear on 3 levels. The first level is what she calls the external thing, like public speaking, like what I'm doing now. I'm doing a webinar or doing a public speaking in front of a crowd, asking for a raise, right? Or asking someone out for a date. External things that can influence or impact a fear factor in us. Level 2 is the internal feelings or the internal fear, feeling rejected, feeling a sense of disapproval or helplessness and hopelessness. So this fear factor creeps in internally. And then the third level of fear she talks about is what she calls the real fear. The real fear is when we say to ourselves, the consciousness contemplation, the thing happens, we have consciousness contemplation and we play it out in our heads. If I do this, then F then, and then we say to ourselves, well, I can't handle the outcome. And that's the real fear. Not knowing how I will handle the outcome. That's the crux of every fear, element of fear, and according to her book, that we have to contend with. What if I fail? What if I lose control? It's the what if factor that leads to inaction. So what she says in this book, which I thought was really fascinating, somebody recommended this to me when I started my business 18 years ago, because, branching out from, consistent income to an entrepreneur income, there was a lot of fear that I had to deal with and overcome, but I felt the fear and I did it anyway. And 18 years later, here we are, right? So in her book, she says, if we ask ourselves, or if we say to ourselves, what if I say to myself, I can handle being rejected from my peers if I say something to the higher up person that's being insensitive or inappropriate to other team members. And I used to go to lunch, every day with Bob or Casey. And now as a result of me saying something, I'm being shunned. I can handle that. I'll just go to lunch with Cynthia. I'll ask Cynthia Newman, let's go to lunch, right? That's what I'll do. So what if you say to yourself, I can handle that. I can handle losing a job. I have employable skills. I have 2 degrees. I have a good resume. I can just find another job. I can handle that, right? So she says, if you say to yourself, what if I can handle it? Then the question that she asks is, what is it to the fear? I just think it's a powerful psychological reframing of this concept of fear, that I can handle it. If I can handle it, then I'm going to say something because I can handle the outcome of me speaking up. Before we get to responding to microaggressions, I just want to open up the mics real quick. So if we can do that, allow folks to unmute, because I want to get your thoughts and concepts, thoughts and insight on what we've been talking about so far. So we talked about the types of microaggressions, and then we talked about these response barriers, why people don't respond as a result of indifference, silence, and this concept of fear. And fear, I love acronyms because I think it's an easy way to remember information. Fear is just false expectations appearing real. We won't know if we don't go. If we don't go and do it, we won't know. So with that said, any comments, any questions, any thoughts, any ideas that you want to put on the table before we jump into the response protocol?
I think with the fear, this is Mr. Belk, sometimes it's from past experience. I know like at sometimes at our job, when you went to discuss your concerns over how somebody acted or whatever, upstairs or 12, as we like to call it, would make it seem like you were the person wrong. Because they would ask questions like, well, what did you do and all that. So sometimes it made it seem like you were the victim or you were wrong for even coming up. So it kind of holds you back from doing it the next time.
So I call that a counter narrative barrier. Now you bringing something up, and now a counter narrative is put in place, Mr. Belcher, to make you appear like something's wrong with you. But 10 other people have expressed the same thing. Now let me ask you a question. Oh, this is to the whole group. What is the worst thing that folks in the upper 12 can do in an organization when it comes to the presence of microaggressions or prejudice in the workplace? What do you think is the worst thing that they can do?
I think the worst thing is they can let it keep happening.
That's it. That's it, Karen.
That's even in encouraging it. It's giving it the okay. It's encouraging it, and it's discouraging those of us who are trying to say something and stop it.
Yep. And so if you have a pen and you're taking notes, I would want you to write this down. The worst thing that someone in a leadership position can do when they see it or receive report is nothing, because no response is a response. And when a person in a leadership position of an organization doesn't respond, particularly if it's a homogeneous makeup leadership team, they don't respond to microaggressions time and time again. All the things that you all said, it condones the behavior, it makes it seem like it's normalized, but it also depletes the leadership sense of credibility, and it creates what we call optics of oppression within the organization. Yes, it gets brushed off, especially when it's coming from someone in leadership, especially if that person has an untouchable demeanor. Thank you for that, Ellen. Right? So we can't sit idle, because no response is a response. So if you're in a leadership position, you see something, you don't say anything, that's a response. It's inaction, right? So let's look at how to respond now, right? Let's talk about how should we respond. There's many models out there that deals with this topic of microaggressions. There's the anti-bias educational model, the interrupt model. Then you have the speak up model, which was developed by the Anti-Defamation League. So there's plenty of models out there, but I like the University of the Colorado University model because it's real simple, and I think you can do this. This is what I call an in-the-moment response protocol, and it's real simple. It's the name it, claim it, stop it. So the name it protocol, I'm running this meeting, and somebody says something that's either racially inappropriate, prejudicial in nature, anything that's inappropriate from demeaning someone's social identity makeup, and something is said that's inappropriate or insensitive. I name it immediately. I call immediate attention to the problematic behavior or comment that was made. There is no offline discussions. There's no waiting to the next meeting, the next 2 weeks. I immediately address it. And we teach the use of what we call the 3-word approach to immediately address that behavior. What you want to do in this case is you want to attack the act, not the person. You want to attack the act. So somebody says something that's inappropriate or insensitive, and you're in a meeting and you're leading this meeting, you just say, hold on, wait a second, let's pause for 1 second. That sounded awful. Was that necessary? That was offensive. That is unacceptable. The one that I like to use, my go-to 3-word approach is help me understand. Help me understand. We're in a budget writing meeting, and somebody says something that is racially inappropriate or throws a microaggression on the table in a quote unquote jokingly manner. And I pause and say, wait a second, help me understand. What does that have to do? Remember that, I'm talking to that, not the person, that comment. What does that have to do with us? The mission that we're on today? We're here today to complete this budget so we can get this grant application completed by close of business today. So you name it, right? That's the first thing you want to do. Name it and use the 3-word approach to attack the act, not the person, right? So here's an example. You're wrapping up a debrief meeting with your team members, and one of your supervisors say, wow, I can use this information during my next powwow with my folks later this afternoon. So you pause and respond, that was unnecessary. It is my understanding that the term is an offensive appropriation of a term of great cultural importance to indigenous folks. For those who don't know what a powwow is, it's a celebration of American Indian culture in which people from diverse indigenous nations gather for the purpose of dancing, singing, and honoring the traditions of their ancestors. So when you name it, what you want to do is you want to offer and utilize that moment as a teachable moment. So you name it, then you claim it. You want to state why you're uncomfortable with the situation, or why you're upset with what was said. Why does it make you feel uncomfortable, or why it may offend other people that's a part of, again, if we're using the Native American example, that's a part of the Native American community, even though you don't employ anybody that's Native American on staff. This is a teachable moment to break the so-called quote unquote unconsciousness or lack of awareness. Well, now this is an opportunity for us to make you aware of some information about that particular term. So you want to claim it. And we teach use personal response sentence stems when you're claiming it. When disagreeing or having an opposing thought about a presenting related racial issue, we want to use what we call personal sentence stems. I feel, I think, in my opinion, based upon my experience going to the Native American Festival 2 years ago, I see how they really embrace this as a very cultural, relevant, and important and meaningful activity. And I don't think they would, take it, well if we were using that term so lightly. So when we use personal sentence stems, it reduces the potential for intergroup conflict. When we keep it on the I and we don't say you, we don't get accusatory to the person. We're addressing what was said. Because, okay, if we give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe it was unconscious, maybe it was implicit, maybe they didn't know. So here's an opportunity for us to crack in and do some what I call consciousness coaching. So here's an example of claim it. Whoa, that assumption about trans folks makes me feel uncomfortable. I know it maybe was not the intent to stereotype, but statements like that could easily be interpreted as hurtful and offensive in a manner, right? So in this case, we're talking about this concept of intent versus impact. So the person said, well, I didn't intend to be offensive. That was not my intent. As a leader, I'm not more focused on the person's intent. My job as a leader of an organization is to assure the physical as well as psychological safety of my staff. So I have to address how it was impacting, how that statement impacted someone. If the person is now emotionally or psychologically impacted in a negative way, we cannot allow it to go unnoticed. And then the last one is, so we named it, we claimed it. Now the key is we have to stop it. Again, help me understand, right? We want to ask questions to seek understanding. If the person, hear the person out. My intention was not to do that. Well, unfortunately, Jennifer doesn't feel that way. She's impacted by that statement. We have to deal with that. And then we want to finish our discussion with that person that's the initiator of the behavior by expressing feelings of your discomfort with that and by giving future directives to discontinue that type of behavior. So for example, using my 3-word approach, help me understand, how does that joke have anything to do with this meeting? I don't think making light of sexual assault like that is funny. In the future, here's the future directive. In the future, I would appreciate it if we do not make jokes like that here at VIP Community Services. So I named it, claimed it, and now I'm putting in measures to stop that behavior. Now, most people say, well, what if they continue to do it? What if it was the first offense? Or what if they keep doing the behavior? Well, here's a strategy for dealing with that. Let's say that the person didn't know, that it was unconscious, and their intent was not malicious in nature. That's fine, but we still had an impact. We had a negative impact on an employee. We have to address that, right? We teach utilizing what we call a cognitive learning approach, where you would count, if you're a supervisor, you would counsel, then you would coach. And then if after you counsel and after you coach, and the person continues to do that behavior, to exhibit or display that type of behavior in the workplace, then you got to cut. So you counsel, you schedule a follow-up meeting after the incident, but you addressed it in the immediacy in real time. So when we counsel, when we coach, and when we cut, the whole idea here is we want to increase awareness and the person's level of cultural competency and sensitivity, and that hopefully will help to improve employee retention. So if you don't get anything out of today's webinar, I'm going to challenge you all, the 60-something folks that's on this call today, for the next 30 days, if you see or hear or witness or it's brought to your attention, I want you to at least practice the name it protocol, raising it to the conscious level. If it's unconscious, let's just raise it to the person's consciousness level. Just name what it is. Even if you name it and you just got to walk away. Wow, that was insensitive. And if you got to walk away, if it's not the time to address it fully, but at least name it. We cannot sit in the seat of silence. So let's take a look at this short video clip and see if you can identify any of the microaggressions that are occurring. And then we'll come back and I want to get some feedback on how you would have named, claimed, or stopped one of these issues here. Let's take a look at this.
Hi, Joe. Sorry I'm late for the call. I had a perfect morning, had to catch the last set.
You surf?
Yeah, I'm at Ocean Beach pretty much all the time. You?
Totally. We'll have to go when I'm up there next week.
Hey, I'm stoked. Epic.
Sure, sounds good. Are you John?
Joe? Oh, yeah. Great to meet you. I totally had you pictured different in my head.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but, anyways, can I get you a cup of coffee?
Yeah, sure.
My hair looks crazy. It looks like a mess.
I don't believe it. Your hair always looks awesome. I mean, how do you do it? Do you twist it? Do you do it yourself?
Yeah, I twist it myself.
Oh. I mean, do you mind?
Oh. Yeah, actually, I do mind.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, if you're really curious about it, there are like tons of YouTube videos out now about natural hair, so maybe check that out.
There's no way we were gonna make it to that date.
No. I have no idea what they were thinking. What are you doing this weekend?
Going to the beach with some buddies.
Dude, sunscreen. You've already got quite the tan. Where's your family from?
Here.
Yeah, but before here, where are they from?
Still here.
But before that?
A few generations from here.
Cool. Sorry.
And so just in this last clip, I want to just analyze and dissect that for a second, because the microaggression manifestation of this last clip is what they call alien in your own land. And it sounds exactly what we just saw here, where a person will ask you where you're from, where were you born, you speak good English. And the message behind that is that you're not American, although you were born in this country for generations, pay taxes, law-abiding citizen, but you are viewed as an outsider or a foreigner. This is the whole concept of othering, a manifestation of this particular microaggression, alien in your own land. The other one is what we call ascription of intelligence. When someone says, wow, you are a credit to your race, to that first generation Hispanic college student, or they say, you are so articulate, or why do you speak white, which I don't understand what that means. Like, what does that sound like, right? And I have a colleague of mine that grew up in Camden, New Jersey, like this, and she graduated from Harvard University. So oftentimes people say, where did you go to school? And she say, I graduated from Harvard. How you graduate from Harvard? How did you graduate? You grew up, didn't you grow up in Camden? I mean, not no progressive people can come out of, Camden. I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, right? Anybody know New York? South Jamaica, Queens, Camden, these are urban communities, but good people, decent people come out of those communities, right? So when you think about that last clip or any of the other clips, when the young lady was asking the gentleman there about his heritage or where he was born, that was an example of alien in your own land. Now, if you was an earshot of that, or if the young person or the gentleman came to you and you were their supervisor, and they said, I was highly offended by my conversation that I had with, and let's say her name is Jill, with Jill, and you're Jill's supervisor, how would you address the situation now that it's reported to you, third party, and you're Jill's supervisor? How would you utilize the name it, claim it, and stop it protocol while speaking with Jill about what was reported to you from, let's say, Jason? Anybody want to take a stab at it? How would you name that? It's quiet. That means everybody's thinking. Utilizing the 3-word approach. You're in your supervision session with Jill, and you're addressing this report that you got from HR regarding this complaint. How would you use the 3-word approach in your session with this person?
So if I'm her supervisor and Jason has come to me about it, I'm wondering, when I approach her to talk about it, now I'm calling Jason out. Well, Jason felt uncomfortable, even if I don't say Jason, but to refer to that event, if I wasn't there.
I mean, the caveat, you got the report from HR. So HR gave you the report, right? That a staff member complained about Jill's behavior, insensitive behavior, and you get the report from HR, and you need to address it.
Yeah, I guess I'm keeping in mind how much I'm kind of calling him out and putting weight on him in bringing up that situation. Like, that's part of my thought, as opposed to just addressing it with her. And maybe I shouldn't worry about that, though I'm thinking, what's the effect on him? But maybe it's two questions. I'm trying to answer both questions.
It's a good point. We didn't have time in this session to do it, because this is just a chunk of a 3-hour training. But you're alluding to a good point that we addressed in the in-person 3-hour training, which is perceptions. Our perception of the situation has nothing to do with how we should respond. And you're showing why, because right now, by you having a perception of the situation, you're hesitant to respond. And so we gotta put our perceptions on the side, and we just gotta deal with the facts. The facts are you received a complaint from HR that the person that you supervise, your supervisee, was engaged in this inappropriate behavior. Now, we could perceive and have all this perception all we want, but however, as a leader, we still need to address the situation. So the question is, how would you utilize the 3-word approach to deal with Jill's behavior? If it was me, it would go something like this. My perceptions are off to the side. So we're having our supervision session. And so, Jill, by the way, before we wrap up, I just want to bring something to your attention, right? That I've received this report from HR regarding an interaction you had with one of our fellow colleagues, and I understand that it was inappropriate. So help me understand, and I would read the whatever was said. Help me understand, how does that help strengthen team building philosophy here at VIP Community Services? How does that comment align with our mission of the organization? So I feel that those type of words can lead to, disconnect from team members. And in fact, the person that was on the receiving end of that, they felt really highly offended by it, to the point where they had to leave work today. So moving forward, here's the future director. Moving forward, I would appreciate it if we can respect and honor the differences of all employees, regardless of their social identity makeup. So you see that I just went through the process and just named it, I claimed it, and I gave a future directive to hopefully stop that behavior. Now, if it continues, then you have another issue that you need to deal with. Does that make sense? Did that help with that? So again, unfortunately, in the virtual world, we don't deal with, but we go through a whole perception test, and we show folks how your perception of that situation, if you allow that to come into play, it actually can create a barrier to responding. So thank you for your courageous contribution to the conversation, Karen.
Hey, Keva, this is Jean. I just wanted to also respond. I think that if Jill, I think that offering Jill or the employee the opportunity to think about it and say, and when we say, and moving forward, that has the potential to, be harmful language, and it's insulting, and your colleague had to go home, and moving forward, it really raises an awareness, because it's likely that Jill is insulting other staff members also. So in terms of calling out Jason, she's likely communicating in that way across the board with other colleagues. So it's a great strategy. Thank you.
Good point. Good point. Awesome. All right. So here's our takeaways from today's session. Thank you all so much for your attention and for your input and your, a semi-interactive interaction here today. So we know that microaggressions are subtle, but they are impactful. We need to be mindful of that, and that it is important for us to recognize and address microaggressions. It's very important. We can't let them go unnoticed or unaddressed. Eradicating the bystander syndrome is the first call of action to dealing effectively with microaggressions. And here is our evaluation for today's webinar. And thank you all for your participation. This was great conversation.